All right, so we talked about earlier today on the first panel about kind of what happens when there's liability in the CISO and you're in this position. Then we also talked about collaboration and breaking up silos. So just imagine this, right? Imagine if there was a lobbying group to advocate on behalf of security and CISOs. Who would sign up for that? Nobody? Okay, fine, you guys are on your own then. But no, seriously, this next panel is going to talk about advocacy, putting up a unified front for security, not just in your internal workplaces, but also to the government, externally, be able to help you actually make your case. So I want you to bring your hands together and clap for David Mahdi, Vaughn, Hazen, and Penny Longman. So
spinny chair.
I want to say this really quickly.
Like I'm so far away here.
This guy brought a typewriter up here to actually have his do his presentation. So we'll see how this goes. But
oh, thanks, Octavia. Well, you know, I've got to keep it professional around here. Somebody's got to do it. No, we actually had some really good prep sessions for this panel, and we had a good number of notes. So just having it here to make sure we cover some of these topics, because look, the CISO role, cybersecurity roles are difficult as they stand today, and they're only getting more difficult. Between the threat landscape, technology changes, AI and automation threatening our jobs, maybe, all of these things are coming together, and I think we have to come together as a community, and we have to be champions for each other, and that's kind of the spirit behind this panel here today. So as we get started, Penny, I'll just start with you. For the audience, why don't you tell us your background and what your role is and the perspective you'll bring today in this panel.
Yeah, thanks. Happy to be here. So Penny Longman. I am the Director of Information Security for Fraser Health Authority in BC, one of the larger health authorities in Canada. I've been there for about 3 years. Before that, I was in the private sector in mining. And the biggest difference, I don't know if any of you are in mining, but the language is way better in healthcare than it is in mining. And yeah, so coming to this as a relatively new in the public sector, and that's kind of the perspective. And I'm also very active with ISACA, which the Vancouver chapter is one of the most active chapters actually in the world. So, you know, thinking about it from an advocacy perspective, kind of bringing that perspective as well.
Okay, excellent. Vaughn.
So I'm Vaughn Hazen. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at CN Rail. I've been there 4 years. Prior to that, I was CISO for Freeport-McMoRan, which is a mining company based out of Phoenix, Arizona. So some interesting background that we have in common, but I have a long history, and I don't want to bore you with it. So.
All right. So that's the perspective we're bringing here today. And what we're going to start off with is actually the CISO role itself, right? Some companies haven't invested in it. Others, the CISO could be in a different business unit, having different reporting structure. How many people here actually are in the CISO role? And it's called that, by show of hands. Okay. So a handful. How many report into the CISO? Show of hands. Maybe a little less. I don't know. I am like blinded by the light, literally. Well, I guess if we start with the evolution of the CISO of the role, and I know for organizations certainly that I've worked with, it differs. And I think we all say that it was Steve Katz at Citigroup. But from your perspectives and your industries, have you seen it naturally form, or did someone have to really champion the effort? And Penny, I'll start with you.
Well, in public sector and government, things are usually very, you don't have a lot of flexibility in the just suddenly deciding to add new roles or new groups. The security was very much an extension of IT, and still does report into IT, at least in the most of the BC government roles.
Yep.
And it just kind of grew out of the IT people not having enough time to deal with security, so they created the extra security role.
Okay.
It was very organic, I think.
It was organic. Okay. Okay. And Vaughn, did you see a similar evolution in your background?
So actually, at Freeport-McMoRan, I was the first ever CISO there.
Okay.
They are a Fortune 500 company, publicly traded, and I can share this because it was in the news at the time. But the reason I was hired there is because they had an incident and got religion around security, so they needed somebody, and I built out the program there for the 7 years I was there.
Okay, okay. Again, I'm trying to make this interactive, people, so please help me out here, or help us out. Show of hands, I mean, that was an interesting scenario. Has any incidents caused investments in the people, process, or technology? Show of hands if incidents have done that. I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so more of them. So yeah, it definitely seems to be something that it's just human nature, right? We react, and sometimes we're not going to spend money on it or time until it becomes a problem. I think we're well past that point, and I think, with all these new regulations coming in, I think what I want to start off again, I know there's already been discussion of it today, but the liability issue, right? So what are your thoughts on that, where it shifts with all this stuff going on?
Well, what I found interesting, so first of all, I think that Bill talked about it fairly well this morning in the earlier panel, but you look at Joe Sullivan, who was convicted, you look at Tim Brown, who's been charged, you look at what's been happening in the environment there, generally the liability is increasing, and then you look at things like Bill C-26, where there's penalties that are applied to individuals that could be up to $1 million a day. And I don't know about you, but I could be wiped out pretty quick with $1 million a day fines going on for a few days. So, it is getting concerning that we see this growth in the liability for individuals. And we were talking about it earlier, where it seems like you've got regulators that are applying penalties and associating those with the CISO before there have been any really codified standards on what the CISO responsibilities are, where they report and things like that. So we have some concerns where the liability is coming faster than we've got clarity around our roles and unified acceptance of standards of what it means to be a CISO.
Yeah. Penny, your thoughts on that?
I'm potentially less concerned about the actual liability and more around the uncertainty of what, like Oren said, what standard am I supposed to be working to? That hasn't been defined yet, and yet you're able to be held liable for not meeting a standard that is not clear. So that's the biggest, it's the uncertainty around the role and the responsibilities of the role and the variability across different organizations. By all means, hold you accountable and liable, but only if it's as clearly defined as many other roles, like we talked about CFO or, some of the other ones with, right to practice designations. That's a lot. The uncertainty for me is the bigger concern. Yeah.
There's certainly, when you think about stick and carrot, as they say, right, incentive and penalty or fine, there's certainly a lot of emphasis on the stick when it comes to the CISO role. So I guess it begs the question, Penny, I'll start with you. So based on all of that, do we need to formalize something? Do we need something more formal here as a community?
So I think we do, as with anything I feel in security, we need a lot of outreach so that the organization understands the nature of the CISO role and that responsibility, and also potentially puts the CISO in the right place in the organization to be able to accept the responsibility. For instance, I report into IT. If my leadership chooses not, and they don't, but chooses not to report something up, which then goes to the board, but I'm still officially the security person,
Yep.
then there's that mismatch in responsibility and accountability. So I think one of the first steps is to just have more understanding in the organizations and on boards as to the nature of the CISO role and the responsibilities. Mm-hmm. And again, I think in the larger community, we definitely need, well, to a certain extent, we need somewhere we can go and have some therapy talk about what it's like to be a CISO or to hold that responsibility. But I really do think we need to be something other than just, oh, it's the CIO and the CISOs.
Yeah.
So I do think there needs to be something that is just around our organization, the work that we do, and the responsibilities that we have. I do think there is a need for that because it's a very separate role from the CIO, where it was sort of kind of grew out of.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, it might be different on the sector or whatnot, but Vaughn, your thoughts on formalizing an approach here, a structure? Because again, it just feels like there's so much liability, so much pressure on the CISO role, but general lack of understanding of clarity and all these things together.
Yeah, well, I mean, you look at it, I talk to CISOs who have privacy responsibilities, whereas other organizations, the legal team has the privacy responsibility.
Yep, the privacy officer or whatever.
Yeah, and our organization, the business continuity is actually falling under CN Police. We actually have our own police force, but I've talked to other CISOs who have that business continuity responsibility. Technical responsibility for the enforcement of the requirements versus the governance and risk responsibilities. There's a lot of variability, and when you start to regulate the accountability without having any standards and clarity on who owns what, it can put you in a pretty precarious situation. Now, granted, with a lot of senior roles, you exercise influence rather than direct oversight. But when there are responsibilities, for example, you look at what happens with Sarbanes-Oxley, the CEO and the CFO have to sign off on the financials, right? They have direct responsibility over most of that whole process.
Yep.
Especially the CEO. They can influence absolutely everything about it. But when they have that accountability, they also have that responsibility, and they're empowered to do something about it. If you start to put that on to the CISOs and they don't have the empowerment to actually drive changes that need to happen in order to comply or in order to reach some standard, which, by the way, as you mentioned before, Penny, it's not completely clear what those standards are. Then you start to have some challenges, and that's where the liability becomes a real risk for individuals in these roles.
Yep, yep. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm a big fan of NIST, but obviously it tends to be a little more technically oriented, right? But I've worked with many CISOs that would say, hey, if I follow, these, I don't have to adhere to them, but if I follow them, I know I'm at least doing right by my company and following the security framework or digital identity framework or whatever it might be. But Penny, this is a question for you. So being a part of ISACA, do you think groups like that or ISC squared or even the CyberX community, do you think these are like maybe an appropriate place to start maybe the groundswell of formalizing, getting clarity as a community on these things?
It is, but you can only do so much with volunteers, right? In our chapter in Vancouver area, we've tried to do some advocacy at the provincial government level, but it's just, we have an extremely active chapter and we still struggle to get the right people to do that kind of advocacy at the government level, just even finding spaces for people to meet, right? It's the kind of thing that, yes, those organizations can do it, but give them $300,000 so they can have a person and a place.
Yep.
They could do an awful lot more if they had a person to organize it and a place to always meet, I don't think a lot of the organizations could take that on as they are now and really be able to deliver on it, because the same people who are already active in it would be having to take on that extra responsibility. So absolutely, those organizations are good because the people in those are ones who care about doing something, but it's not, I think, something that you can just expect more volunteers. And a lot of areas don't have extremely active groups either. So yes, and it has to be supported in some way.
Yeah.
I do want to touch on something that you just mentioned, saying, hey, if you follow NIST or something, you feel like you're doing right by the organization. What we have to remember is that any framework was written to address the risk at the time that it was initiated. Those frameworks typically take about 2 years to go through the process. So your framework, it's about 2 years old in terms of the risk, environment. That's why they keep having to update the frameworks. But the other aspect of that is a framework is designed to give you, that more holistic view.
Yes.
And sometimes there are things in the framework that may not apply in your particular situation, and you really have to look at, what is my risk profile? What are the concerns that I have? And it takes some expertise to really be able to apply that properly. So I would challenge that, hey, if I do this, I'm doing right by my organization. I think you have to show a little bit more imagination and understand your specific organization, what they do, what's their risk profile, where are the concerns that come in, and what could happen, and are we really structured to be able to prevent, detect, respond, and recover from those particular events.
Yeah, Vaughn, I think that's a great point on these frameworks. They're guidelines, right, to provide guidance. So, but it's an excellent point. I think just on the community side of things, I think Penny, I guess it's kind of like, we'll get more out of it if we put more into it, right?
Yes, but not necessarily. I mean, more people is good, but there still needs to be some consistency and some oversight. Yes, so more people, but there also, I think, has to be some sort of funding or something for it. It's not something that a lot of volunteer organizations can, because I've worked on organizations completely separate from cybersecurity for other things, and it's just not necessarily sustainable when it's all just volunteer driven.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
But we also have to be careful not to fall into the trap, because we know there's some analyst-driven organizations that are charging you for the privilege to go in and develop the content that they then turn around and sell to others. And I don't think that's the model that we want to follow. You need professional folks that are full-time driving that organization, making sure that we have advocacy, that there are lobbyists, and helping shape the regulations that are going to impact us all. But it should be done in a way that's not going to rob us blind, because frankly, I think that you do see some of that happening with the analyst group, and I'm not going to name any names.
Are you picking on me because I was a former analyst?
No. No picking.
I think that brings up a good point, and just feel free to jump in, because I just think of cities up north that have had ransomware attacks, and they just don't have the talent. They can't attract the talent. They can't maintain the talent. And to me, Vaughn, you bring up a dangerous area, which is like equity and inclusion of kinds of organizations to be able to join these groups, so they can get the advice. And maybe if they're a small public town and they don't have the population, they have to run digital services, but they're not gonna have the ability. That's my fear in the community, and I think that for sure we need to make sure that these things are accessible, and we can't charge $200,000 a year to talk to somebody and download a couple of research notes. Like, that's not gonna move the needle for what we need here. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that, if you've seen issues with equity and inclusion in that regard. But that's one thing that strikes me, that we have to make sure as a CISO community that no matter what sector you're in, no matter what your budget is, you should be able to have a voice and join the community. I don't have the solutions, but I think in this day and age, it's much easier to connect remotely. I see one of my neighbors is David Spark. He runs the CISO series, and he has fun with these types of things, but he has to bring on sponsors to pay his people, right? So I don't have any answers, but I don't know what your thoughts are on that, on trying to bring the community together, trying to make it, equally accessible for all.
Yeah, I think there's a term that's been coined for that in terms of the cybersecurity poverty line, that
Yep.
references the fact that some organizations don't have the means to have enough people and have enough tooling and capabilities to really secure their environment, especially with what we're seeing today. And I think that you have to structure your technology around the budget and capabilities that you have. And there are ways of doing that to make it more secure. But you've also seen where larger organizations who have a network of suppliers and partners that are smaller have come up with, approaches to help bring them up. Because, the fact of the matter is you operate in an ecosystem,
Yep.
and, your suppliers, your partners can have a direct impact on your cybersecurity posture, especially if you have connectivity with them, if they have access to accounts that can manipulate anything in your environment.
Yep.
All of those kinds of things can have a direct impact on you. So if you're not doing something for them, then you may end up finding consequences from, second, third tier folks that are in your ecosystem that you may not have even realized are there.
Yeah. I'll just comment really quick. So the World Economic Forum published a Trends of Cybersecurity. I think it came out not too long ago. And one of the areas they flagged with data behind it, because I think Deloitte helped them with this survey that they do every year, and it was the cybersecurity poverty point. And saying organizations that just don't have the money, they're the ones who are going to suffer the most. And I keep thinking, again, of these hospitals and cities that are either publicly funded that they just don't have the ability to invest in all these shiny tools and people to respond. But yeah, that was a good point. Penny, I don't know if you have any comments on this here.
I think this question 5 years ago would have been a really big thing, but I think now, with the ability and the standard that most organizations have some sort of virtual ability to meet and connect virtually, I think that's changed a little bit. In BC, our health authorities are geographical. So northern is sort of Prince George North, and Prince George is about 8 hours from, 8 or 10 hours from Vancouver. So they could not come to a meeting, but we can certainly, if we have a meeting, they can certainly participate. So, and if we're expecting the partner organizations to fund something like this, then absolutely, it's still a really big issue, because, like you said, they don't have money to fund their own operations. They're not going to be able to contribute to an organization. But if we're just talking about being able to connect people and get the people in the room having the conversations, I don't see that as big of a difficulty. It's also just getting to all of the, before I was with Fraser, I was a small, medium-sized mining equipment and supply company, and it was only through the managed services provider that I sort of got to know the larger sort of security ecosystem and sort of started getting connected to people. I think there's a lot of small, medium-sized businesses where the security leader isn't even aware of even just organizations that they could look to for support. So I think that's definitely is how to make all those other people in those smaller organizations aware, and then they would be able to attend, whether virtually or not. So I think that part of it's less of an issue, but it's still just getting the message out that there are these organizations that are looking to help.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, I think we have some time left. We can certainly end early, but we thought maybe we could keep on talking here. There's many other points that we could still get to. But we can open it up to the audience if there's any questions you'd have on anything we brought up, or maybe something we didn't bring up. I'd love to hear the thoughts of the audience on this topic, coming together as a community, having the communication flow, whether you're in the public sector, private sector, heavily funded, or you're one of those companies that just has a very tight budget on these things. So I think I can't see, I don't know if we have someone running around with a mic, but I see a hand over there. Yeah, I mean, maybe you can yell it out loud. I think they might be bringing a mic to you. I literally cannot see. Should have wore sunglasses. No, you don't have a mic? Okay, I'll just try it. Yeah, yeah. I was wondering what your opinion is. Yay! There we go. Thank you.
I think the role of the CISO, we know it's a balancing act, right? And we always talk about balancing between delivery and security. One of the things I have seen in the governance realm is there's also a balancing act that I find trying to align to industry frameworks, you know, and we're doing that continuous maturity, you know, models, and we want to mature the program. So I used to be in governance, and we instill policies that, you know, we have to be at this level. Always, I feel like it's an ideal. And then there's this realistic approach and understanding that technology, there's a huge technical debt, and sometimes it's not even possible, or it's going to take years. So maybe if you could talk about the good enough approach, and like, how do you prioritize? Because I feel like sometimes it seems impossible that we're actually going to get there, and you're going to have the best-in-class security program where you're going to score 4 on every single, you know, scale of the NIST framework.
Yep. I'll kickstart it, and you guys jump in. I was one of the analysts who put together some of the models for a big analyst firm, and yes, we would do these IT scores, and we did them out of 5, and 5 was ideal, but it was like something that you would strive for, but no one would ever achieve a 5. Even when I ran workshops, and there were some major banks who will go unnamed, Canadian ones, and they're like, we're all 5s with governance and technology, and I'm like, no, you're not. You're lying. Stop it. So it was always, you know, to your point, something we would strive for as an organization. But I think the key thing that a lot of people took out of it wasn't necessarily the exercise in and itself. It was understanding where they sat relative to their peer organizations. So they would say, hey, we scored a 2.8, and then you'd say, well, for a public sector that's maybe on the west coast of Canada, healthcare, the average is actually 3. And then you could laser in and then use that to create a business case to then go to leadership to say, we need either people or funding or whatever. So anyway, that's my view of it. I don't know if how you guys feel about these.
You can go first, Penny.
I do sometimes feel that the rating systems have been weaponized a little bit.
Okay.
Just in that, you know, good enough would be great, but good enough now, ooh, that's level 3.2 is good enough, you know, or so. But they do, I find they're very useful from they structure everything so that it's very easy to report out what you're doing because you have that structure, and that's sort of the flip side of it. So I think they're very important and valuable in the way to communicate to the rest of the organization and even amongst yourselves. And like you said, I think what's really valuable is comparing you know, is this apples to apples? We don't, you know, healthcare, we're never going to get to a 4 or a 5 because doctors are doctors. Are there doctors here? Doctors are doctors. And we're in the business of saving lives, not, you know, I always say I'm really glad that airlines and aircraft manufacturers and banks are aiming for very high security, right? Especially every time I get on a plane. But with healthcare, it's always that balance.
Yeah.
But being able to say, oh, the majority of healthcare organizations of your size are around here, that I think that's more valuable to, you know, comparing yourself to others than to some sort of abstract standard.
Okay.
So I'm going to take a different view. Imagine that you've been hit by a big ransomware event, and you're a publicly traded company, and your shareholders sue, and you're on the stand, and you have to say, well, we thought it was good enough. You know, imagine yourself in that situation, or imagine yourself, you know, being deposed because you're being charged because you said our security was good enough in the current climate with the SEC. I used to work for somebody who you know, had the good is good enough attitude, and you know, I struggled mightily under that approach. It is a balancing act. You do have to recognize that your primary mission is to enable whatever the mission of that organization is in the face of evolving cyber threats. That's your mission. That's what you're there to do. And it's a house on fire sometimes, you know, so what you have to do is say, okay, we're triaging, right? It's a case of what are my priorities, and you can always justify what your priorities were. You can say, okay, here was the situation, here are the priorities that I was dealing with because I saw these as the biggest threat that I had to deal with, and, you know, frankly, I didn't have unlimited resources, and you know, you can't just get unlimited people either. Yep. You know, so it's going to take time also to make changes. So you can justify, this is my risk-based approach. You know, I saw these as the biggest threats, and this is the approach that I've taken in order to manage what I saw as the biggest risks in a way that I felt we could accomplish that. I personally would not say it was good enough, but I do agree with you that those benchmarking opportunities
Yep.
are a way that you can communicate, you know, to the board. And whenever you talk to the board, you have two missions. One is to keep them from completely panicking, and the other is to help them to see transparently where the risks are. And that, again, is a balancing act. Everything that we do is a balancing act. But I would stay away from the good is good enough approach, personally.
Excellent. Well, I think we've run out of time, but I think I'll wrap us up here and just say that I mean, even Vaughn, to the point you just made, that's where the rubber meets the road. And I think for folks in the audience, hearing stories about how they take these frameworks, how they make them work for them, you know, how you compare yourself to your peers, how you're dealing with, you know, a large budget, small budget, public sector, private sector. It just shows that we have to come together as a community and share all of these, you know, battle stories with each other, and hopefully success stories too. And just don't be strangers. Reach out. We're all in this together as a community, and you know, we have to do this. The job isn't getting easier, and we have to have each other's backs. So thanks for attending the session. We'll be around if there's any other questions, but thank you. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Good.